Hey guys, welcome to the very first Possibly Plausible, and today I'm going to be talking about the only unsolved case of air hijacking in commercial aviation history, the legend known as D.B.Cooper. Today's story is a true crime classic that's had some interesting suspects come forward relatively recently, so let's jump in. The skyjacking. On November 24th, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, at around 1 p.m. in Portland, Oregon, a well-dressed, soft-spoken passenger using the alias Dan Cooper buys a one-way ticket on Northwest Orient Flight 305, a Boeing 727 bound for Seattle. The plane lifts off at 2:50 p.m., with 36 passengers, 6 crew, and nothing out of the ordinary. Until roughly 10 minutes into the flight, Cooper, after ordering a bourbon and soda, smoking a few cigs, slips the flight attendant Florence Schaefer a typed note. She initially ignored him, assuming he was just flirting and being a creepy businessman, until he leant over and told her, "Miss, you better look at that note. I have a bomb." After that, he asks her to sit next to him. He calmly reveals a briefcase filled with 8 red cylinders that to Florence looked like a bomb. To this day, we don't know if it actually was a bomb, but considering how cartoony that is, I'ma guess it was not. He then dictates his terms to her. $200,000 in negotiable US currency, all in $20 bills, 4 parachutes, 2 main, 2 reserve, and a fuel truck waiting in Seattle. Florence Schaefer then made Captain William Scott aware of the situation, who relays the demand and circles the airport as the FBI and police hurry to assemble the cash and parachutes. The FBI photographed the serial numbers on all of the bills before taking the money to the airport, and acquired 2 civilian sport parachutes, one of which was a dummy, and 2 military ones. While the plane circled, flight attendant Tina Merklow was sent to sit with Cooper. Cooper remained remarkably composed, ordering a second bourbon and soda and smoking cigarettes. He offered one to Tina, who initially refused, saying she was quitting, but then changed her mind, as most of us smokers would, because honestly, that's gotta be so goddamn stressful. Being there with someone who could kill you. Obviously, he's being very polite and very nice, but there's a very implied threat there. I just think that'd be a trippy cigarette. Cooper was polite but firm. When Merklow asked him why he chose Northwest Orient, he replied with a laugh that it's not due to a grudge, but simply because he had a grudge, and the flight route and aircraft suited his needs. He also casually pointed out that they were flying over Tacoma, indicating some familiarity with the local geography. Tina noted that Cooper displayed his only moment of irritation when she became too personal and asked where he was from. He obviously answered with a non-answer. At 5:40 p.m., the plane touched down in Seattle, Tacoma. Cooper keeps the cockpit crew and attendant Tina Merklow on board, who is directed to get the money and parachutes before Cooper releases the passengers and orders a refueling. So, here's another interesting part of the story. His flight plan was clearly unrealistic, but probably intentionally so, because he wanted to fly southwest to Mexico City, which, okay, I'm going to give you a lot of plane talk now that I don't really understand, but apparently this makes it unrealistic from everything I've read. He wanted to fly at 10,000 feet, which I don't know what that is in real numbers, with the gear down, flaps at 15 degrees, speed locked at 200 knots, and most critically, the rear air stair left unlocked so he could deploy it in flight. Northwest management tried to push back, but what can you do? He's got a bomb on your plane. They agreed, but they explained that they'd have to stop in Reno to refuel, and Cooper agreed to this. At 7:40 p.m., the jet takes back off with only the pilot, engineer, Tina Merklow, and D.B.Cooper on board. Cooper cuts one of the parachutes to tie the money around his waist, probably the dummy parachute, as it was never found on the plane. People will talk about that later, about, maybe he jumped with a dummy one and he wouldn't have survived. No, if he's tying the money to himself, he's probably using the dummy chute. He then orders Tina to open the door, which, I think is one of the more assholey things that this dude is going to do in the story. If I'm honest, that's so dangerous. She was obviously too scared to open it, which, absolutely fair enough. At which point he was like, okay, and sends her back to the cockpit. And that's the last time we know that D.B.Cooper was ever seen. At around 8:10 p.m., somewhere over southwestern Washington, cockpit instruments spike as the cabin abruptly depressurizes. The air stair warning light flicks on. This is when he's thought to have jumped. Experiments where a desk was thrown out of a plane to simulate a person jumping have agreed with this. When the 727 lands in Reno at 10:15 p.m., the cabin search turns up only his black JCPenney clip-on tie pin, 8 cigarette butts, and 2 of the unused parachutes. Cooper and the money are nowhere to be found. The investigation. The Manhunt, codenamed Norjack, has agents map an elliptical drop zone that sprawls from Ariel, Washington to the Lewis River Valley. Search teams comb the hillsides and the Columbia floodplain. Nothing turns up until February 1980, when 8-year-old Brian Ingram digs up 3 packets of decomposed 20s, $5,800 in total, out of a sandbar, 20 miles downstream from the suspected flight path. No other ransom bills have ever been circulated. The FBI finally shelved active work on the investigation on the 12th of July 2016, but the 1971 grand jury indictment means that he could always be prosecuted. There's no statute of limitations. So here's a fun fact, that they actually installed something on planes on the exact model of plane, the 727, called a Cooper vane. And it's just a spring-loaded latch, which is used to stop other people being able to open the stairway mid-flight, and they named it a Cooper vane. The evidence. Considering how long he was on the plane, he left a wildly small amount of evidence. 66 partial fingerprints, none of which in national databases, and we're not even sure how many of those are his, as it's like a plane and a bunch of different people could have been on there. A tie that would later be found to have small amounts of titanium and bismuth particles, rare earth metals that are said to be very specific to the aerospace industry. The tie also had a small amount of fragmentary DNA, but the FBI can't be sure it's his, as it easily could have been contaminated and it is yet to be properly identified as anyone's. Cigarette butts that might yield DNA were lost in a bureaucratic purge, whatever the hell that means, sometimes in the 1980s. And that was honestly pretty much it. He's just a ghost, just jumped out of that plane and disappeared into the night. Okay, so now we're going to get to the real meat and potatoes of this, the theories and the suspects. So how am I going to try to break this down? I'm going to first give you some of the official theories, then I'm going to give you all the suspects that were named over the years, and after that I'm going to give my own little 2 cents, what I think might have or might not have happened. Right, so let's jump into it. So I suppose the real question is, did he survive the jump? So the FBI is pretty firm he couldn't have survived it. Including Special Agent Larry Carr, who led the investigation for a period. He's very vocal about the fact that there's very little chance that Cooper could have survived. However, a lot of copycats have made very similar jumps and survived, and experts have mixed opinions on his chances. So I think discounting the possibility of him surviving is probably not, factual. And it would probably make for a pretty boring video. So, okay, let's break it down. If he died in the jump, neither the body nor the parachute has surfaced, despite logging, construction, satellite imaging, and people scouring the region for 50 years. However, on the other hand, which I do think is a very good point for him dying, is that none of the money has ever circulated. They've systematically checked bank deposits, Federal Reserve loads, casino counts, and not a single note has ever pinged. And for none of it to be found in 50 years is, I would say, the most compelling argument for him having died. I have no idea how you would launder that kind of money for it never to come back into circulation. But if anyone does know, and doesn't mind outing themselves for knowing, please comment down below. I'd love to hear about how someone would do that. Some investigators now pivot to the tie's metallurgy, convinced Cooper worked in one of a handful of Northwest aerospace labs, and practiced parachuting on the side. Some kind of introverted engineer who, with some obsession and a plan to hijack a plane. But even if that's the case, where's the money? What's the point of hijacking it if you're not gonna spend the money? You're just doing it for fun. And I also don't love just, speculating on some nameless character that maybe worked in a lab. It seems futile. There's also a French language set of books about a flying ace named Dan Cooper. And I don't know if it really matters, but it's used as a compelling thing with suspects, so I'll mention it. Yeah, so who would have guessed it is not that clear. We don't exactly know, but there have been some really good suspects over the years. Let's have a look at them before I go over what my personal theory is. The suspects. There are 9 main suspects that I found interesting enough to mention. So in no particular order, let's begin. Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. He enlisted in the army twice, first as a demolition expert in Vietnam and then again as a helicopter pilot. He earned a Purple Heart, an Army Commendation Medal, and a Distinguished Flying Cross. So he's like a commemorated dude. He's got he's got medals to his name. He studied police science at Birmingham Young University and taught Sunday school in Provo, Utah. He also devoted weekends to skydiving. So, this dude is an army guy. He's done some serious combat and some very exciting stuff, so high pressure is probably not an issue for him. He's studying police science, so he would know how, he would be up to date with how to conceal the crime, and he's into skydiving. Pretty interesting so far. On the 7th of April, 1972, just 133 days after D.B.Cooper vanished, McCoy walked onto United Airlines Flight 855 in Denver carrying a hand grenade and a pistol, using the alias James Johnson. The aircraft was pointedly another Boeing 727 with a rear air staircase. McCoy slipped the captain a sealed envelope of instructions. Land at San Francisco, take on $500,000 in $20 bills, load 4 parachutes, and clear the ramp. The passengers never realized they were hostages until they were safely off-boarded. With the cabin depressurized and the jet flying low and slow over Utah, McCoy bailed out into the night. Parachute on his back, money in a duffel, exactly as Cooper. Just, honestly, like a little bit better of a job. He got picked up by some dude. He just decided to hitchhike, and that guy tipped off the police. Investigators heard rumors that McCoy had recently bragged about the perfect skyjacking. A search of his Provo home found a rigged jumpsuit and $499,970 of the ransom still billed in bank straps. Fingerprints and handwriting matches sealed the indictment. Convicted of air piracy, McCoy drew 45 years in federal prison. His flair for high-risk exhibits resurfaced in 1974 when he and 3 cellmates hijacked a rubbish truck, crashed it through Lewisburg, Pennsylvania prison gate, and went on the run. FBI agents cornered him in Virginia Beach 8 days later. McCoy fired first, agents returned and killed him on the 9th of November 1974. He was 31. Because his hijacking mirrored Cooper's so closely, true crime writers quickly floated the idea that McCoy had pulled off both jobs. The theory never convinced case agents. Cooper's eyewitnesses described him as mid-40s smoker who sipped bourbon and soda. McCoy was a clean-cut 29-year-old Mormon who didn't drink or smoke. Not that he couldn't have, hidden those aspects of his life from everyone or have, just smoked and drank as a disguise. However, McCoy had a strong alibi. He spent Thanksgiving 1971, the Cooper night, at home in Utah grading papers for his criminal justice class and taught Sunday school the next morning, confirmed by church logs and dozens of people who went to church. The FBI ruled him out as Cooper, but kept him in the file as the most accomplished copycat. So an important recent development in 2021, YouTuber and aviation investigator Dan Grider gained access to a North Carolina property once owned by Karen McCoy, widow of Richard Floyd McCoy. While exploring an outbuilding, Grider discovered a deteriorated military-style parachute rig hidden away for decades. He described it as a 1 in a billion match to the one supplied to Cooper in 1971. McCoy's children, Shantae and Rick McCoy III, confirmed they found the parachute after their mother's death in 2020. They turned it over to Grider, who documented the find in his probable cause videos. In late 2023, the FBI searched the property, took a DNA sample from Rick McCoy III, and seized the parachute for forensic testing. Though the case remains officially inactive, no results have been released. So McCoy's skyjacking proves something important. The jump was survivable. I personally think McCoy is the strongest suspect. He obviously was able to make a similar jump, however he didn't have any of the money, and he did have an alibi, which seems pretty tight. However, the parachute is really interesting, and it's a massive shame that the DNA will be too fragmentary to get a conclusive match. Kenneth Peter Christensen. Kenneth became a subject of speculation when his brother, Lyle Christensen, suspected Kenneth might have been Cooper. Lyle claimed that Kenneth bore a striking resemblance to the FBI's composite sketch and had circumstances that made him a compelling suspect. He pointed to Kenneth's military parachuting experience, his employment with Northwest Airlines, and his sudden financial prosperity after the hijacking. Despite these claims, the FBI dismissed Kenneth as a prime suspect, citing discrepancies in physical descriptions, skydiving expertise, and a lack of direct evidence. While some independent investigators and enthusiasts continue to debate his possible involvement, no definitive proof has ever linked him to the crime. Despite these claims, the FBI dismissed Kenneth as a prime suspect, citing discrepancies in physical descriptions, skydiving expertise, and a lack of direct evidence. While some independent investigators and enthusiasts continue to debate his possible involvement, no definitive proof has ever linked him to the crime. So, I mean, I feel like I don't really have to talk about this one too much. His brother thought that he was Cooper, but didn't really have much of anything other than that. So I think I'm honestly just going to move past him. Robert W. Rackstraw. Robert was born in 1943 and is the most enduring of the Cooper suspects, because he basically lived an action movie. He dropped out of high school, earned his paratrooper wings in Vietnam, became a helicopter pilot and explosives instructor, and left the army with a stack of decorations and a dishonorable discharge for lying about his education. Back home, he slid into a long streak of fraud, aircraft theft, beating a murder charge. Specifically, he got acquitted of killing his stepfather. Even prosecutors who put him behind bars later admitted he was magnetic, a hell of a con man who could have talked anyone into anything. His colourful backstory is precisely why cold case documentarian Tom Colbert and a band of volunteer sleuths locked onto him. They argue Rackstraw's flight skills, parachute training, explosives know-how, and roguish charm check every box for Cooper. Colbert's team also points to playful anonymous letters mailed to newspapers in the 1970s. Homemade codework allegedly hides Rackstraw's name and units, and the newly unsealed FBI memos that they claim reveal agents privately regarded him as the prime suspect, while shielding him because of supposed CIA ties. Again, however, the evidence on this is a little flimsy. I've researched this a lot, and yeah, we'll get to this. Rackstraw himself was a massive tease. When reporters cornered him, he'd grin, adjust his sunglasses, and drop a non-answer like, "Could have been." Asked point blank in 2016 whether he was Cooper, he shot back, "I'm one hell of a lot smarter than him if I wasn't," before hanging up. The cat and mouse routine kept the cameras rolling and the legend growing. In 1971, Rackstraw would have been 28, more than 10 years younger than every eyewitness estimated him to be. The FBI said that the sketches pegged Cooper to be in his mid-40s. The crew members never picked Rackstraw's photo out of a lineup. When Larry Carr reopened the file publicly in 2007, he conceded Rackstraw was looked at very hard, but later wrote online that no verifiable evidence tied him to the crime. Partial DNA evidence recovered from the tie Cooper left on his seat was not matched to Rackstraw either. So Colbert and the sleuths insist that post-mortem Freedom of Information Act releases prove a government cover-up. Former agents counter that the file shows only an energetic, ultimately exhausted investigation. So I looked into this a bit, right? And from what I can tell, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of a cover-up on this one, or a very good link to the CIA. However, if anyone can find something I didn't, please feel free to leave it in the comments. So I do really like Walter Rackstraw as a suspect. You know, the fact that he teased it, I think he could have easily been capable to do it. You know, however, there isn't a lot of proof for or against. So, you know, I would leave it as plausible, but definitely not proven. So I totally see why people always talk about him when they talk about the D.B.Cooper suspects. But moving on, Walter Recker. In 2018, a fellow Michigan parachutist released audio tapes in which Recker allegedly confessed, naming landing sites and cold weather injuries. Yet Walter offers no ransom cash or corroborating witnesses who saw him post-jump, and his timeline demands a 30-mile hike through the night. The FBI was invited to hear the tapes, but never confirmed any follow-up. So, you know, I assume it's just a dude claiming he was a famous criminal, and, you know, one of his mates recorded it and sent it to the FBI. I find him wildly uninteresting, and I'm just gonna discount him entirely and move on. But, you know. But he's always put on the list, so I thought I'd at least talk about him a little bit. Sheridan Peterson. Sheridan Peterson was an American Marine veteran, teacher, and skydiving enthusiast who became a notable suspect in the case. Peterson served in the Marine Corps during World War II and later pursued higher education, earning degrees in English, philosophy, and journalism. He was known for his expertise in skydiving and even experimented with homemade bat wings, which fueled speculation that he could have been D.B.Cooper. Peterson bore a striking resemblance to the FBI's composite sketch, leading some investigators to suspect him. The FBI even tested his DNA against particles found on the tie, but he was never publicly cleared or officially identified as D.B.Cooper. Peterson himself acknowledged the speculation, once stating, "Friends and associates agree that I was without a doubt D.B.Cooper. There were too many circumstances involved for it to be a coincidence." However, he claimed he was in Nepal at the time of the hijacking, providing an alibi. He's not a terrible suspect at all, but, again, there's no money. They didn't admit whether the DNA came forward or against. I think if it hadn't, partially matched, that probably doesn't guarantee you prove either. Let me Google that. So because it's fragmentary DNA, it wouldn't, even if it did match, it wouldn't prove it. So he's a good suspect, but again, this wouldn't be a 50-year-old unsolved mystery. Had definitive proof, now would it? Moving on. Dwayne Webber. Dwayne Webber was a World War II veteran and career criminal who became a suspect in the case. Webber had a history of fraud and forgery, spending time in prison for various crimes. He's got a load of different aliases, and he's known for being a smooth-talking con man. However, he gained attention in the Cooper case when on his deathbed he confessed to his wife, Jo Webber, "I am Dan Cooper." Jo later recalled that Webber had nightmares about leaving fingerprints on a plane, and she found that an old Northwest Airlines ticket among his belongings, the airline involved in the hijacking. She also noted that he drank the same bourbon Cooper ordered on the flight, and he had a knee injury he claimed was from jumping out of a plane. Despite these claims, the FBI ruled him out as Cooper. His fingerprints didn't match any of those found on the plane, and the DNA recovered from the tie wasn't a match either. So, are you guys starting to see something? We got a lot of, people claiming family members, or themselves, or other friends, other people are D.B.Cooper, with very little evidence. And we're going to see a lot more of that. However, so, I don't know. I think he either confessed it to his wife on his deathbed, and he'd been wanting to make himself look like D.B.Cooper for years, or his wife made it up after he died, which is a weird thing to do, but, people do weird things all the time. Yeah, okay, that's enough for that. Lynn Doyle Cooper. Lynn Doyle Cooper was named as a possible suspect in the case by his niece, Marla Cooper. She claimed that her uncle, who she called L.D. Cooper, was involved. Marla stated that she remembered Thanksgiving 1971, when her uncle and another relative were planning something mischievous. The next day, L.D. returned injured, and his family was celebrating, suggesting that he had come into money. She later provided the FBI a guitar strap and a photograph of her uncle, hoping to match fingerprints with those found on the hijacked plane. L.D. Cooper was described as a war veteran, familiar with Pacific Northwest, and an outdoorsman. The FBI never really stated if they thought he was a suspect or not. And here's the thing, I think Lynn Doyle Cooper is an interesting suspect, because he did have a military history, he did have a criminal history, and people talking about crimes in a family setting is a real thing. So, I could see that. However, the fact that they went out and potentially came into money and maybe got scuffled up, I think it's not necessarily as cut and dry as he was D.B. Cooper. He could have been a million different criminals. There's a million different things he could have been going out to do. And, this is also the memory of a child, that's told years later. So, there's no money. It's interesting, but I wouldn't call it very definitive. Ted Braden. A Special Forces legend who ran covert halo jumps in Laos, was once described by a commander as having the perfect mix of genius and criminality. He was obviously a great parachutist because of his military experience and the fact that he competed in professional skydiving competitions. He went absent without leave more than once, smuggling contraband for cash. He was actually court-martialed for desertion, but still somehow got an honorable discharge. He fought in the Congo as a mercenary, where he may have been in contact with the Dan Cooper comic books, French speaking. However, Braden was 5'8", 2 inches shorter than the lowest eyewitness estimate, and no link to the ransom bills or any of the metal particles on the tie has ever surfaced. So, Braden is obviously a strong contender. He would have been capable of doing it. Criminal past, excellent parachutist, but again, just no evidence. So, I don't actually see really any reason people link him to it, other than he could have, he would have been able to. So moving on. Barbara Dayton. born Bobby Dayton, was a merchant marine gunner, later a licensed pilot who transitioned in 1969. Close friends say she confessed to the hijacking to them, claiming she disguised herself as a man and pulled the skyjacking to spite the FAA, and then swore them to secrecy. Barbara's own FBI interview files notes as cooperative subject whose physical features and voice failed to excite eyewitnesses. Agents never found logistical evidence that she could have had any part in this. So, I personally just think she's confessing to a crime to impress her friends, and then they've dobbed her in. Really unfortunate for her, mate, but, shouldn't go confessing to stuff you didn't do, should you? Across 50 plus years, every promising lead hits the same dead ends. The ransom money vanishes after the kid finds the money on the sandbar, and the DNA on the tie is too fragmentary for a conclusive hit. And after the 8 Rowley cigarette butts were lost, I don't think we're going to get a more complete DNA match. Until the money surfaces, a body emerges, or next-gen trace metallurgy narrows down the field to a single machine shop, the legend of D.B.Cooper will remain a mystery. So let me talk about what I think happened now. Because I do think a few of the suspects were pretty compelling. Someone like McCoy or Rackstraw definitely could have done the jump. They definitely could have committed the crime. I don't think, unfortunately, there's any evidence to link them to it. And again, the money. If they had, what would have been the point if they weren't going to spend the money? As I said at the start, from all my research, I was not able to find a way where you could launder that amount of money without a single dollar getting back into circulation. And this, as I said at the beginning, this has been checked by casinos, Federal Reserve, all banks, and not a single note has been found. I think the most realistic thing is that it was an unknown person who did it, and he either died or found a way to launder the money. More likely, I think he died and is in some hard-to-find place, like the bottom of a lake or a crevice. I know that's not an exciting thing to end this on, but I do think it's the most likely scenario. If you guys have anything to add, please leave it in the comments. I'd love to hear your guys' theories. And I really appreciate you watching, especially if anyone's still there at this point. This is my first ever YouTube video. I've really enjoyed making it. I'm definitely going to be making a lot more. I hope to make an episode a month to begin with. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this. Have a great rest of your day. Peace.